To securely support business applications, you need an authoritative identity store. LDAPSync helps you build your enterprise directory using information from other systems, like SunDS, AD, and other LDAP v3 compliant directories. The solution lets you migrate the data you want from any number of sources, and, if desired, also keeps this information in sync over time. LDAPSync is built on TDI. It's deployed in minutes, is highly configurable via parameter settings, and since it's built on TDI, is platform independent and easy to monitor and scale. The rest of this video is a step-by-step tutorial for deploying the LDAPSync solution. I'm going to walk through the setup of the LDAPSync solution. So here I've got my LDAPSync zip, which you can get from the ISM library. And we're going to just unzip that here in my solution directory. Now inside this folder there are a number of different types of files. We have mapping files, we have a custom script.js where we can put our own custom script functions that can be used in the mapping files. And the mapping file, if we just take a quick look at one of these, it's simply the list of attributes that will be now written into TDS. And on the right-hand side, there's either nothing, which means we'll use the same attribute coming from the source, or there's a call to a scripted function, as this example here. Or we could, for example, say that SN is coming from a source attribute called last name, if that were the case. I'm going to just leave this file like it is because I know this will work as it is coming from the sources I'm going to be synchronizing. There's the full documentation as well as a few slides in the deployment PDF to give you an overview. Then we have the properties file, which we're going to have to configure and set up for this to work. We have the LDAPSync XML file itself, finally down here, which is the solution. So let's bring up the deployment PDF. And I'm going to step down here, first to this page, to simply point out that to run LDAPSync, you have to have at least TDI version 7.1.1 with the FixPack 2 installed. And you're also going to need to apply the following fix. Now there's an additional fix also, which will be available very shortly, which is recommended to use. Then there's a page here which simply talks about the types of files. Then we have a slide here that shows you the steps to LDAPSync deployment. So you install TDI, you unzip the LDAPSync as I have just done, you configure the property file, which we'll do in just a moment. Then we run test connections, and this verifies both property settings as well as connections to our source and target systems. And then we can do a simulated migration just to see what kind of data would be moved, and then finally a full migration or an actual migration, followed by starting the synchronization. Now there are two very important concepts here in LDAPSync, that of endpoints, which represent the various systems we're going to be integrating, and flows. And flows are simply connections from source endpoints to target endpoints. And there's a little example of properties. So by setting up the names of properties in a specific way, we are defining endpoints and flows. So an endpoint here in this example, called AD1, it has an LDAP URL property being set. Down under flows, we see the assignment of source and target endpoints to a flow called AD1 flow. And just to go quickly through and show these slides, we have the various global settings, so simulation, whether we have a simulation or not. Then we have preserved containers, true or false. If preserved containers are true, it means that we're going to mirror the directory structure in the source into our target TDS. If we say false, then it means we're going to just take all the person entries out of the source and put them under a specific container in the target, and then do the same thing with groups. And then we have paths for the log directory, the number of log files, and a progress count. We'll look at that in a moment. On the next page, we have our source parameters. We have the connection settings. We have containers to migrate and containers to skip, where we specify which parts of the source tree we want to actually migrate and synchronize. And then a set of properties that determine what types of entries we're going to be working with. And finally, we have the synchronization settings. So we have something called a state key, which means that the connector remembers between runs what the last change that was processed is. So that way, if for some reason LDAPSync is stopped, once it's restarted, it picks up where it left off. And then we can choose to use notification services if those are available in the source system. And if we do, we don't need the next two properties for timeout and polling. If we don't have notification services or choose not to use those, then we instruct LDAPSync to periodically poll for changes in the source system. Then the target settings, again, we have connection settings. We have the object class to use for person entries to be created, and which attribute will serve as the relative DN in the DN for the entries that are created. And also what group entry should look like. The object class to use and the attribute used for membership. We have a number of mapping files, which I've just spoken about. So we have one for each type of entry. We've got a person and group, regardless of the object class that we're using for person and group entries. But then we have one map for each specific object class of containers that we're going to be migrating. And these can be defined per flow, so we could be reading from multiple sources. And in some sources, we're going to be creating a different types of entries, for example. Or we're going to be reading different types of entries. And it says at the very bottom that map files can use simple maps, JavaScript, or expressions, and just an example of these. But there's more documentation on this in the full documentation PDF. And then finally, some examples of how properties can be used, can be specified globally, how they can be specified for endpoints, which then override a similar property if it's global. And then finally, at the very bottom, we have flow-based properties, which override both global and endpoint specific properties. So let's just close this. And then we'll take a look at the properties file. This is really where all the work is done. So at the top, we've got some notes here and some examples of how to run the assembly lines. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. So here we have our global debug equals true. This will result in additional information being written to the log files, which can help us do troubleshooting. And there's the log directory property, which is by default LDAPSync/logs. Two things to note here. First, that since we've unzipped this LDAPSync into our solution directory, we can use a relative path, because the solution directory is always the current working directory for a TDI solution. And the second is that we can use forward slashes. And by doing this, it means that these properties will apply just as well on a Windows installation as they do on a Unix installation. I'm going to say I only need a history of 2 log files. I don't need that many. And this next property, if I omit it, I get no progress count on the command line. But I'm going to say I want a progress count every 5, just so we can see something's happening. We have simulate is on by default, true. And here's my global preserve source containers. And this is set to false here. That means it's going to be flattening the hierarchy from the source and then to the target. So let's scroll down a little bit and we get to some properties I'm going to have to set. So here I define the flows for my solution. And these are just names that I make up myself. And these can be based on, for example, the business unit or the organization that owns that source that I'm going to be reading from. I'm going to call mine just AD flow, since it's coming from AD. And then I'm going to define a couple of flow-specific properties, which are going to specify what the source and target endpoints are. So AD flow, the same name that I used above, in cases is very specific here. Source endpoint equals, and I'm going to call this endpoint AD. and then we'll say AD flow target endpoint equals TDS. So now I have to start defining some properties for these two endpoints. Scrolling a bit further down, we'll look at the source settings. So here, I'm going to replace the word source with ep.ad. That's what I do. Whenever I create an endpoint-specific property, I take the full property name and remove the word source or target from it, and instead type in endpoint and the name of that endpoint, case-specific. This is because an endpoint can be used as a source or a target, as we saw above when we designate source and target for a flow. And I'll have to do that for all of these source properties. You'll notice here also I have this curly brace protect, curly brace minus token at the beginning of the line. And this instructs LDAPSync to rewrite this file and encrypt the password so that it's not going to be in clear text on disk. I'm also going to uncomment this line because I definitely want to read the binary attribute object GUID, which is the globally unique ID for every Active Directory entry. This is going to be brought across to TDS, converted to a string representation, and saved there. That way I have a unique identifier for every Active Directory entry, which is important because when an entry is deleted in Active Directory, it's converted to a tombstone, loses almost all of its data, but I still have this object GUID, which means I still can relate this to the entry in TDS to know which corresponding entry to delete. Furthermore, Active Directory domain controllers typically have a page size limit imposed, which means it will limit how large a search I'm allowed to perform. So if I'm trying to synchronize or migrate an entire directory, my assembly line could fail. But by setting up a page size here of 500, which is going to be well below the limit, which is typically 1,500 entries, that means that my solution will be searching invisibly to me on pages of 500 and thereby get around this size limit. The change detection type for this is going to be AD, and you can see from the comment line above it that I have three options, AD, SUN, or TDS. And this just simply is which change detection mechanism is going to be used. This property I don't need to specify. If I don't specify the state key, then one is generated for me which will be specific for this flow. So I'll just comment this one out. I'm going to use notifications from Active Directory, which means I don't need these next two properties. And finally, in order to pick up delete operations or delete changes coming from Active Directory, I have an additional search base, which has to be set to the root suffix of my domain controller. And that's because these tombstones of deleted entries are also moved to underneath a node called, or a container called, cn equals deleted objects. So I need to have my source AD search base set to the root suffix so that way I can reach the cn equals deleted objects container. Now in addition, in the full documentation there's a link to a tech page on the Microsoft website that outlines how you must configure your Active Directory domain controller so that cn equals deleted objects is visible. Otherwise, LDAPSync will not be able to detect deletes. And then we say what kind of object classes we'll be getting. And from Active Directory, we'll get user for person entries, and we'll get group for group entries. As far as the type of containers that we return, they'll be of type OU or of type container. So if we're going to migrate the built-in containers like cn equals groups, cn equals users, these are returned as object class container. So I need to specify that here as well, and I'll just do that as OU equals container because LDAPSync will convert these to an organizational unit when they're brought across. And in order to handle this, I also have to set up a mapping file for this container object class. So let's copy the organizational unit map, make a copy of this file, and call it container.map. And that will satisfy the needs of LDAPSync. Now, we're not going to be moving containers anyway, but I'm just showing you here. So if you were to preserve the containers from the source to the target, then you would need, and you were going to do some of these containers that are found in Active Directory, you'd also have to provide a container map. All right, and then we have the search base AD. Let's see what I haven't done yet here. Oh yes. And the attribute in the source entries that will be used to create the DN of the entries that will be written to TDS is going to be the CN, because I know that many of my entries, probably all of them, in my AD at least, don't have a UID attribute. So I'm going to use the CN attribute, and this is not case specific. I'm going to use the CN attribute to provide the value that'll be used to create the TDS DN. And now I have the two semicolon, these are the only properties that are semicolon separated in values, that determine which containers in the source to migrate and which ones to skip. And I'm going to define these for the flow. So for this flow, I'm going to read from, and let's take a look at TDS, or at AD, to see what those containers look like. So here I have a root suffix of dc equals com, and below there I have a lot of built-in containers. I have OU equals my groups, OU equals my users, and CN equals users. And CN equals users contains both user entries as well as group entries. So I'm going to specify all three of these. Now, I don't have to specify the full DNs. OU equals my groups. But when I specify CN equals users, I'm going to specify the full DN. Because that way, in case there happens to be subgroups with CN equals users that might appear someplace else in the hierarchy that I don't want to migrate, I don't want it just triggering on this text and saying, okay, yes, I'm supposed to bring this over too. And I have to spell groups correctly also. And then in the containers to skip, I can also use either full DNs or just text that I don't want to see in any DNs, which are going to be migrated. So I'm going to drop everything that has administrator in it, anything that has test in it, or the $sign. Okay, now it's time to look at the target properties. These will be my TDS endpoint. So again, I replace the word target with the EP dot and then the name of my endpoint, in this case TDS. I don't need binary attributes written here because the object GUID will be converted to a string and stored in a special attribute. And here I define the object classes that I want for a user, and this can be a comma separated list. So this is actually the full structural hierarchy of the iNet.org person. I have the object class for groups and the member attribute that will be used. And this property looks like it's here twice. I'll have to clean that up. And then I have where I want in the target, which container do I want to put users into, and which container do I want to put groups into. So going back to our LDAP browser, let's look at TDS. And under the root suffix O equals sample, I have OU equals Oslo, and then I have OU equals AD. So this is where I want to put it. And I'm going to put my users under a new container that will be created for me called OU equals users, OU equals AD, OU equals Oslo, O equals sample. And we'll save this. And now it's time to test it, to see if well, actually not quite yet. I now have to set values to all of these. So I'm going to just pause this video while I set up the values. Okay, while I was away, I discovered I'd made a slight mistake. I had set this property to be EP80 search space, but I forgot the little case AD here for the name of this property. So this was endpoint AD search space. And I saw that because I ran test connections and I got this error here for the change detection AD. So one of the change detection parameters was wrong. So I went up to the top, looking here at the flow report, and I could see for the change detection that the source AD search space was undefined. And then it struck me that I had forgotten the AD.search space. So I had changed source to EPAD, but I'd forgotten to put AD search space. So let's just try running this again. And while this is starting up, I can also show you that I've run this one time already. It's now created or encrypted the passwords for me. The first thing that's printed, which I was up and showed you before, is the flow report. So the flow report here is giving us a list of all the properties. We'll take a quick look at that. Giving a list of all the properties, what the actual property name is in TDI, which property it found to set this, and then the values here. So a quick way to troubleshoot is to go down and to make sure that you see the values you expect to see here for the various properties. And then you can find out which property is actually assigning this value. If we look at the results of the test connections, we can see that everything was successful. So all the property checking worked out, and the connections to both the source and the target systems also is functioning now. So now we can try running the LDAP migrate in simulate mode. We can see here that we are flattening the hierarchy. That message is important that we see, which means our preserved source containers is false. You can also see that the object class specified for person entries is used for the search filter, as well as for groups. So our simulated migration tells us that it would have migrated 18 person entries, 19 groups, and 0 containers because we're flattening the hierarchy. So let's try rerunning this. Well, first we can just check our directory to make sure nothing's been written there. So we'll go to our OU equals AD, and we see that there's no entries being migrated yet. And now we'll do the actual migration. We're seeing some errors here, and we'll go into the logs and find out why this is happening. Now, because some of these users are not being migrated, we'll also get messages that some of the group members are being skipped, because LDAPSync carries out some referential integrity checking when it's migrating group members to make sure that those members also exist in the TDS directory. All right, so we had 9 person entries actually migrated, 9 errors. We had 19 groups added. Now it's important to note here that we may have to run LDAP migrate twice, because if we have nested group membership, that means if there are groups whose members are other groups, it could be that the member group hasn't been migrated at the point we migrate the group which has this group as a member. To put it this way, if we run the migration twice, we'll ensure that all the nested group memberships also are brought across. So let's take a look at our log files. So for our AD flow, we have these entries not migrated. This is an LDIF file which contains all the entries that were not passed across. This will allow us then to go in, modify this, and do any work manual if we want to bring these entries in. Or we can make corrections. Let's say if there's something wrong with the mapping, there are missing attributes, we can make a change to the person map, for example, to make sure that these person entries are moved across. The same thing is true here with the group members missing. This is just a log file that shows us all the group members who were dropped. And these will be most likely because they weren't found in TDS at the time when this group was moved and the memberships were translated. Then we have the LDAP migrate log itself. And let's just scroll down a little bit until we find our first error. Now, understanding a TDI error in the logs is we look at the first line or the last line before we start seeing the dump, what is the stack dump, which is printed out for support if you want to send this file to support for more help. And here we get a basic understanding of which flow this was, which assembly line, which component, and where in that component, what was happening. Below that, we see the actual error, schema violation exception. Now, because I've got debug turned on, I've got debug true in my properties file, I'm getting all these special debug lines, which show me various information, including the contents of the connector's cache that it was going to add. So here we see what this connector was going to add to TDS. If I bring that across, we see the translated DN, then we see the object class. This is an inet.org person, this is a person entry. And I know that the person entry must have the CN and the SN attributes. So if we keep looking across here, we'll see there's a UID attribute, the AD object GUID stir, which is the string representation of the object GUID from the AD entry, and a CN. So there's no SN attribute. So if we wanted to make sure all these users were getting in here, we could write add a little bit to the person map file to say that if the SN is missing, let's go down and find the SN attribute. So here we could say if work.sn equals null, then return not available. Else return work.sn. And now these users will be migrated. Let me just save this, go back here and rerun this very quickly for you. Okay, so now things are looking a little bit better. We now have added 9 more users. 9 were unchanged. That means they were read again, but LDAPSync detected that this data was already in place in TDS. There was no need to do the write, and the same thing with the groups. And we still have some members being skipped. So now we can go back to our TDS, refresh this, and we now have an OU equals users, OU equals groups, and all the groups have been transferred here, and all the users here. Now one of the things, as actually the last thing that LDAP migrate does, is to reset the change detection state. And the change detection state is a way for the change detection in LDAPSync to remember what the last change processed is. And when this is reset, it means when I start up sync now, it's going to start only looking for new changes. It'll ignore previous changes. Now, once we've done some LDAPSync, once we've been running this, and if for any reason we stop the solution, when it starts up again, it will use this sync state to realign itself and pick up changes that have occurred since it stopped. So now we can run LDAPSync. We'll have to say actual also because LDAPSync does not support simulated runs. As always, we get the flow report first, and then the change detector is initialized. So now it's waiting for changes to occur. So let's look at our TDS here. So let's take a look at the user Neo. The user Neo has the surname, the bunny. So let's make a change in Active Directory. So under my users, I've got Neo. Last name is the bunny. We'll change this to John Anderson. And now we can see TDI picks up the change, modifies in TDS. So if we refresh this, we'll see that the surname has changed now. So now, just for fun, I'm going to quickly edit my property files to include my Sun directory also as a source. And I'm going to be taking, what I'll have to do here is I'll have to define a new flow, Sun flow. I'll have to define source and target for Sun flow. I'll call that endpoint Sun. They'll share the same target endpoint. I'm also going to take these two flow properties and move them up here where I have defined other flow properties. So I'll have to make a Sun flow, containers to migrate, and if we look at my Sun directory, under dc equals acme.com, I have O equals Americas, and there I've got engineering, groups, and people that I want to move. Those are the three OUs I want to move across. OU equals people, OU equals semicolon. And I'm going to just leave out the containers to skip. So now we've actually managed to add 154 persons, 3 groups, and now finally, when we take a look here, we've hopefully gotten these. Here we go. Now they've been added to the right place. And I had subgroups here as well, under engineering. So now, if I run LDAPSync without any parameters at all, except for actual, it's going to initialize for both of these. That means both flows will be running. And the LDAPSync runs each of the flows as its own Java thread. So they run independently of each other. They'll also be creating their own log files. We received a flow report for each one of the flows. And as we can see in both of the change detectors, one for each flow is initialized. Thank you for listening.